Welcome back to our study of Genesis. Now, I hope before you start this recording that you have read chapter 37 and chapter 38 in the book of Genesis. Hopefully, you've been able to answer the questions on the Q&A sheet that we put in the foyer each week. But if you've not had a chance to read the chapters yet, if you've got time to pause this and read the chapters, you will benefit much more from it. You'll understand a lot more things than you would have possibly otherwise. Well, the Apostle Paul wrote in Romans 8:28 that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Can you think of any individual in the Bible who better demonstrates that verse than the patriarch Joseph? The story of Joseph is about God working his will and his purpose through the everyday events of life. I mean, if we think about it, there were no miracles, and God didn't rearrange any of his natural laws to make things happen. Yet God was directing every event of Joseph's life to accomplish his divine purpose. Of course, now we're looking back on Joseph's life and the working of God's hand in the details of his life, but we have to wonder if Joseph had any inkling of what God was doing at the time. Or was it only as he looked back on it that he was able to say to his brothers, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring it about as it is this day to save many people alive." We'll see that when we get to chapter 50. Now, the same may be said of the events in our lives. If we have surrendered our lives to the Lord, we can be confident that he is causing or just allowing events in our lives that will ultimately achieve his perfect will. We can find great joy and peace in applying that godly principle. Hopefully, as we study Joseph's life, we will be encouraged to trust God in every situation we face. As it was with Joseph, any suffering we may presently be going through could be God's way of preparing us for a significant assignment he has planned for us in the future. Oh, how exciting it is to even consider. Now, Genesis 37 began with a short summary indicating that Jacob had moved into the area of Canaan where his father Isaac had lived. The area included Beersheba and Hebron, where Jacob had lived prior to his 20-year-long escape to Padan Aram, where he acquired his wives and all of his children except for Benjamin. Jacob would remain in the area of Hebron until his permanent move to Egypt many years later. Now, we were told in verse 2 that Joseph was 17 years old and feeding the flock with his brothers, now specifically the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. Now, previously, we have seen that these two women were referred to as, handmaids in chapter 33 and as concubines in chapter 35. However, in this chapter, they were referred to as Jacob's wives. We know that Rachel had died giving birth to Benjamin. It's very likely that Leah, too, had died by this time. If that's the case, Bilhah and Zilpah would have risen in status and would have been referred to as wives. At the end of verse 2, we have the first of several reasons that Joseph's brothers hated him. It said, he brought a bad report of them to his father. Now, we weren't told what the bad report was regarding, but whatever it was, the brothers no doubt considered Joseph to be a snitch, a tattletale. Now, it doesn't appear from the passage, though, that Joseph was guilty of exaggeration or ill will toward his brothers, and nothing was recorded of any personal benefit for Joseph in making the report either. From every indication, Joseph simply gave his father the bad report because of his conviction of right and wrong. He believed his father needed to know the wrong that his sons were doing. Not that Jacob would do anything about Joseph's report if his inaction regarding Dinah's rape, Simeon and Levi's slaughter of the men of Shechem, and Reuben's dishonorable act of sleeping with Jacob's concubine was any indication. On way too many occasions, Jacob had proved to be a passive father, which was not a good thing considering the strong-willed sons he had fathered. This brings us to the second reason Joseph's brothers hated him. Verse 3 states, "Now Israel," that would be Jacob, "Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age." Just a side note here that by our standards, all of his children were born in his old age, since he was 84 when he first got married. But I digress. Jacob's sons would have known Joseph was his favorite son by the many ways Jacob, no doubt, indulged both Joseph and his mother Rachel. Passive parents tend to favor the child who is easiest to raise. As some of us may know, it's difficult to deal with a child who is constantly challenging us and acting disobediently. Since Jacob's other sons were obviously hard to handle, it's no small wonder that Joseph was the golden child. But it was most destructive to the family that Jacob did nothing to hide his favoritism. In fact, he put it on display for all to see by giving Joseph that tunic or coat of many colors, or the richly ornamented robe, as different translations express it. And this would have been the third reason the brothers hated Joseph. One scholar wrote this about the coat, said this garment was only worn by persons exempt from manual labor and by those of rank and wealth. It marked Joseph as one who would succeed his father as chief of the tribe. Other commentators pointed out that this coat or tunic had sleeves that reached the wrist and the overall length that reached the ankles. Add to that the costly ornamentation of the coat, and it's easy to see why the wearer would not be doing manual work in it. I mean, just picture a construction worker showing up to work in a full-length mink coat. Well, it was as though Jacob was saying to Joseph, you can wear this beautiful coat because you don't have to work like those brothers of yours. No reason for jealousy here. Now, the coat also signified that Joseph was the possessor of the birthright. Reuben was the firstborn of Leah, and he would have customarily received the birthright except for his sexual sin with Bilhah. Therefore, the birthright was transferred to the firstborn of Rachel, and that would be Joseph. Well, as if the richly ornamented robe wasn't enough, Joseph was given dreams by God that he then shared with his family, which is the fourth reason the brothers hated him. You know the dreams already if you've read the chapters about the sheaves and the sun and the moon and the 11 stars. Now, why Joseph felt so compelled to tell these dreams to his brothers is not clear. Some scholars fault him for doing so. Others do not, as the double dreams were given to him by God, and we have no indication of what Joseph's attitude was as he retold the dreams to them. Whether it was wise or unwise for Joseph to have told them, God permitted him to do so, and even used the brothers' treatment of Joseph at Dothan as a means toward fulfilling the prophecy revealed in the dreams. It should be noted, though, that the brothers did not dismiss Joseph or his dreams. In fact, they actually took them seriously and hated Joseph all the more. On the other hand, his father, Jacob, seemed to dismiss the legitimacy of Joseph's dreams as, well, just absurd. And he even passively rebuked Joseph. He did, however, keep the matter in mind. If Jacob noticed the contempt of his sons toward Joseph, he again didn't do anything about it. Now, if we just simply picked up the Bible and began reading in chapter 37, verse 12 and following, we wouldn't realize the significance of the brothers taking their father's flock to Shechem, of all places, or of Jacob sending Joseph to check on them. I mean, we would have to wonder, what was Jacob thinking? I mean, is it possible that he was totally oblivious to the volatile situation that existed in his own household? Maybe so, but he didn't appear to have any idea of the danger into which he was sending his favorite son. So in reality, Jacob set Joseph up for the inevitable explosion that came next. We don't know how much time had elapsed between Joseph's dreams and the brothers going to Shechem with their father's flocks. We have to assume that Jacob didn't actually send them to the area of Shechem, knowing what had taken place in the not-too-distant past. But somehow Jacob learned that they were in that area, and naturally it caused him to be concerned for his sons for obvious reasons. But why in the world he would have sent Joseph or allowed him to go all decked out in his fabulous coat, well, that just defies imagination. Even if neither Jacob nor Joseph were fully aware of the extent of the brothers' hatred for Joseph, sending a well-dressed Hebrew lad all alone and roaming around Canaan seems to be, at the very least, asking for trouble. But regardless, Joseph set out on the 50-mile trip from Hebron to Shechem. Fortunately for him, God was watching every step he took. Joseph's basic attitude of obedience to his father's instructions was certainly one of the most significant reasons that Joseph was so greatly used of God in the years that followed. Now, in fact, the brothers weren't at Shechem, and that being the case, it's likely that a lesser young man would have just turned around and headed back home. But not Joseph. He traveled the additional 14 miles north to Dothan to check on his brothers and carry out his father's assignment. Let's not overlook God's providential hand at work in providing the man who found Joseph wandering in the field, who just happened to have heard the brothers say they were going to Dothan. Although Joseph would never be directly addressed by God or make sacrifices to God, as far as we know, God's providential hand was clearly involved throughout Joseph's life. And it's that way in our lives too. When some unexpected event takes place, do we see it as just a random coincidence, or do we attribute it to God? Seeing or not seeing God at work is a choice, but by recognizing God's work in our lives, we give Him the glory. On the other hand, when we attribute the occasion to luck or our own ingenuity or efforts, we steal God's glory. Fortunately, as we grow spiritually, our inclination to do that lessens through the years. Well, one of the brothers must have observed a person approaching from across the fields and pointed it out to the others. Maybe there was something about the individual's walk. Oh, but then they would have recognized that ornamental coat of many colors, and they knew it was that dreamer that they hated. Sadly, their first reaction was to kill Joseph and throw him in a pit. They weren't even going to bury him. I mean, that was the ultimate dishonor, which also says a lot about the depth of their hatred for Joseph. But then Reuben got word of the plans. Now, being the eldest brother, it's likely that he was away checking on flocks elsewhere. He had already fallen from Jacob's favor because of his affair with Bilhah, so he could not afford additional blame for the death of Jacob's favorite son, and as the oldest, he would certainly have been held responsible. So he stepped up to intervene. Even though he suggested they simply throw Joseph into the pit without killing him, Reuben gets credit for his true intent to rescue him later and return him to their father. Now I'm going to have more to say about that in a bit. Obviously, the brothers must have accepted Reuben's plan, but did you notice the very first thing they did was to strip Joseph of his coat? Now, the Hebrew word for stripped is the same one used of describing the skinning of animals in Leviticus, which tells us that they jumped on Joseph like a pack of wild dogs, pulling the coat they hated from him, and probably the rest of his clothes as well, finally dumping him into a deep, empty pit, probably just intending for him to starve to death. At least, they could reason, they had not shed his blood, as Reuben had said. Well, after such a brutal attack, these guys had built up quite an appetite. Obviously, no guilty consciences here. Amazing, isn't it? But what they did next, oh, it gives us chills. We don't know how many hopeless and hungry hours Joseph spent in the pit pleading with his brothers, but it's very possible that it was overnight. At some point, though, they spotted a caravan of Ishmaelite and Midianite traders who just happened to be coming by. That's when Judah had an even better idea. Let's sell him and make some money in the process. And that's what they did. For 20 pieces of silver, which is the same amount that one would have paid for a handicapped slave in those days, they turned their own flesh and blood over to total strangers. What little value they placed on their own brother's life. The hardness of Joseph's brothers was seen in that even though they permitted him to live, they didn't care what the circumstances of his life would be. They knew what slavery in that day meant. Now we know they were well aware of the suffering Joseph was experiencing, because later they would say to each other, "We saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear." We'll see that in chapter 42. Well, any thoughts that Joseph may have had about eventually ruling over his brothers may have died in that pit. As we will see in the rest of our study, things for Joseph initially seemed to get worse, but it was actually the beginning of a victorious life for Joseph in that he was completely under God's control. The dreams that God had given him could only be fulfilled by God himself. Now, what about Reuben? Yes, he was able to save Joseph from murder by his brothers, but we never read that he stood up to his brothers, declaring that their plans were nothing but gross sinfulness and that they could not do such a thing. Reuben would then be guilty later on of going along with his brothers in deceiving their father about Joseph's disappearance. It is true that Reuben was distraught when he discovered that Joseph was gone, but his concern appears to be more for himself than about what had actually happened to Joseph. Where shall I go?" he asked. Well, Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery in Egypt, but God was with him. Because Joseph was obedient to the God he had learned to love, God was able to bring about good in and through Joseph's life. As the caravan carrying Joseph passed out of view, the brothers calmly dipped Joseph's magnificent coat in the blood of a freshly killed goat. Then they took it back to their father, hypocritically asking him, "Is there any chance that you recognize this as Joseph's coat?" What deception? Could it have been any worse? Of course, the bitter irony here was that just as Jacob's sons used their brother's coat and the blood of a slain goat to deceive Jacob, many years before, Jacob had deceived his own father Isaac with his brother's clothing and the skin of a slain goat. Jacob's deception had come full circle. Someone said it's impossible to bring good out of evil, but good can be brought about in spite of evil. Well, so deep was Jacob's grief over what he assumed was Joseph's death that he refused to be comforted, saying that he would grieve for Jacob until his dying day. You know, we have to wonder if, seeing their father's grief, if the brothers felt remorse for what they had done. Now, we know that in years to come they would for sure. Some might say that the brothers didn't actually lie to Jacob. They merely showed him the blood-soaked coat, and he drew his own conclusion. Oh, but it was a lie, because their intent was to deceive their father. Although we may not lie by the actual words we speak, it is possible to lie by deliberately giving the wrong impression or purposely letting a person draw the wrong conclusion. We should never forget that God knows the intent of our hearts. Well, Joseph was ultimately sold to the highest official in the court of the Egyptian king. Yet another instance where one can see either a great stroke of luck or the very hand of God, and I think we know which one it was. Joseph's life reminds us that life is not fair, and it's often filled with tragedies. But it also teaches us that we have a great God who works in the midst of the unfairness and tragedies of life to accomplish His will. As God's children, we are called to give everything to Him, even the bitter and heartbreaking things of the past. By sincerely turning our lives over to our awesome God, we can experience the freedom that Christ intends for us. Things that have caused us pain and suffering in the past, they may still come to mind, maybe even frequently, but they don't still cause us the overwhelming pain that they did initially, because Christ has set us free and given us the peace that only He can give. At this point, we will say, praise His holy name. All right, chapter 38, and I hope you've read this one. Judah then traveled away from his brothers. Now, while away, he married a Canaanite woman. Certainly all of Jacob's sons had been often told that Abraham and Isaac had warned against marrying the daughters of the Canaanites. Even though Judah was well aware of that mandate, he obviously disregarded it. And we know that Judah had 3 sons by this woman, Onan, and Shelah. Now when became a man, Judah, also disregarding Abraham and Isaac's mandate, gave him a Canaanite wife named Tamar. That meant that who was half Canaanite himself, and Tamar, who was fully Canaanite, were in the line to carry on Judah's critically important line in the nation of Israel. I mean, do you see the problem with this union? Their child would have only been 1/4 Hebrew. But Judah's sons, at least and Onan, were wicked. We don't know what did that was displeasing to the Lord, but he is the first named individual in the Bible whose life God took as punishment. At that point, Judah utilized the ancient law known as levirate marriage to marry his second son, Onan, to the widow Tamar. The first child born to this union would be considered to be a successor to the dead brother's line. See, the purpose of the levirate marriage was to help a widow to have both children and economic security in that culture. Onan's sin was making sure not to get Tamar pregnant when he slept with her, which was a form of cheating Tamar, his father Judah, and his late brother God was again not pleased and took the life of Onan also. Now, rarely does the Bible tell us what a person was thinking, but it does in this case when it revealed that Judah didn't want to give Tamar his third son, Shelah, as a husband because he was afraid Shelah too might die like his brothers had. Well, sometime later, long enough for Shelah to have been old enough to marry, Judah's Canaanite wife died. Well, since it was obvious that Judah had no intention of giving Shelah to Tamar as a husband, she disguised herself as a prostitute, seizing an opportunity to produce a child for herself and her departed husband through Judah. Prostitutes apparently covered their faces at the time, or Judah would have recognized Tamar. The payment they decided upon for her services was a young goat. Well, not having one with him at the moment, Judah left his signet and staff as a pledge that he would send her the goat. Now, the signet was not a signet ring like we think of one. Rather, it was a cylindrical seal which he wore on a cord around his neck. And the staff would have been distinctive because of its carving. So everything in this situation was very businesslike. But as a result of the encounter, Tamar became pregnant by Judah. If you read the chapter, you know the story. Judah sent his friend with a goat to pay the woman he thought was a prostitute, but she was long gone. 3 months later, Judah was told that his daughter-in-law, Tamar, was pregnant, and he demanded that she be brought out and burned to death. But as that was about to happen, she sent word to Judah to examine the seal, the cord, and the staff, at which point he would know who the father of her child was. I think it's to her credit that Tamar did not publicly accuse Judah. To Judah's credit, he recognized that Tamar was more righteous than he was, since he had refused to give her to his son Shelah. Tamar was actually pregnant with twins, and the son Perez went on to be in the line of King David, and along with his mother Tamar was in the genealogy of the Lord Jesus Christ. I didn't come across anything that indicated why Shelah, from his marriage to the Canaanite woman, why he was not considered in that genealogy. But I digress again. So it was the Canaanite woman, Tamar, who perpetuated the tribe of Judah in the nation of Israel, which reminds us of the hope of all Gentile nations. Oh, what an amazing God we serve. Now, next week, we will return to the account of Joseph functioning honorably as a slave in the house of Potiphar in Egypt. Be blessed.